All right, well, thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's really exciting to see so many people here. A lot of you I already know, some of you I live with or have lived with. Um, and a few months ago, I would have never guessed that I would be sitting on this front porch talking about this house. And so if you haven't gotten a chance to tour the house, you can do that afterwards. But I first want to start, a lot of groups or organizations start with land acknowledgements, and the Calapooya people have lived in this area for a long time and still do. But I listened to a presentation the other day. It was an interview with a tribal chief, and there's some criticism about land acknowledgements because they say, you know, it's nice to acknowledge that this used to be Calapooya or, you know, land, depending on where you are. And he said, you know, you Americans, you white people, you often talk about rights. You talk about land rights or water rights or housing rights. And this tribal chief, and you know, I can't say that this is what all tribal chiefs would say, but I imagine many would, said, you know, from in our nation, we talk about obligation. And that was profound for me to hear that, because I thought, you know, that's the way I look at the world. I think of the obligation that we have for the future generations, and that people before us have created the world that we live in for better and for worse, and that we have some obligation to make it better for the future. So in a few minutes, I didn't tell you this, but I'm going to ask you to have a little bit of conversation about obligation. And I should just say that can sound like a heavy word, like responsibility, but for me, obligation can also embrace joy and happiness and laughter and hugs, because that's the future I want to be part of, and I want to help create for other people. So that's my version of a land acknowledgement. So I wanted to start a little bit, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Alan, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story. I moved to Eugene in the late 1980s to go to graduate school. And I was looking for housing like everyone else, and I found myself in the student cooperatives, the Janet Smith House. And it blew my world. I loved it. I absolutely loved living there. I became the president of the Student Cooperative Association, and I put a lot of time and energy into it. But I realized, like, I'm not going to be a student forever, and I didn't really necessarily want to live with like 30 people that are constantly changing every, 3 or 6 months. Like, that wasn't my thing. But I was like, how can we make something that includes people of different ages and different perspective and different walks of life? And so I got together with a lot of other people, and including at least Katya. Where are you? There's Katya. Katya was one of the co-founders of the DUMA community, and the short story is we bought a house. We bought a house on Alder Street, which is pictured here on the wall, and there's some really old pictures from the 1990s. There's some pictures of Rachel, who's right here, who lived at DUMA in the 90s, and we put a lot of time and energy into that house, as you'll see by those photos. And the reason why I posted those photos is so you can see that this house looks a lot like that house did 30 years ago. When I first walked in here, I was like, oh, yeah. I remember what this was like when I first walked into the house on Alder Street. So the long story short is that a number of people were co-owners, and some people were renters in that house over the many, many years. And then Lawrence, is Lawrence here? There's Lawrence right there in the chair. Lawrence was the last person who was a co-owner up until 2010. And at that point in time, I kind of scratched my head and I said, well, this has been a collective for a long time. Maybe I should try something different. And so I did do something different, and I took that on as my full responsibility as a way of constantly adapting and learning from circumstances of what worked and what didn't work, because there were a lot of things that didn't work about the arrangements that that we had. But I should say from the beginning that our purpose of the DUMA community has been to demonstrate to people how to live more with a smaller footprint and how to create connections and how to create community. And that's been a learning process the whole time. I continue to learn about that process myself. And after the many years of living in community, I thought, I want to be able to share this with more people. And the problems that we faced in the 1980s are even more pronounced today. I mean, we barely talked about climate change in 1989, but it's certainly forefront and center right now. And we, isolation was a thing in the 80s, but after COVID, a lot of people are really struggling and wanting community and wanting connection. And housing was not very affordable. It's never been affordable, really, but it's just gotten worse. It's gotten worse. And our city is growing, and we're seeing changes to neighborhoods. So for all those reasons, when I rode by this house in early November and saw the for sale sign, I thought to myself, wow, this house has a lot going for it. And I wasn't planning to buy a house. And as I've told some people, it kind of seems a little bit like an unplanned pregnancy. And I'm keeping the baby. And it's going to be costly. But so what did I do is I poked around in the backyard, and I'm like, wow, look at this big backyard. That's kind of uncommon to have a yard this large so close to downtown. This is a place where people can walk and they can ride their bike. And I'll tell you more about that in a second. So I took a look inside like you have, and I'm like, wow, this is an interesting place. This place has got history. So the thing when I was looking for, not that I was looking for another house, but had similar kind of criteria back in the day when Katya and others, when we were looking for a place to have as a collective. And that was a house that could have between 6 and 10 people live in it, because that's kind of a sweet spot between diversity and intimacy. And we were looking for a location that was close enough to downtown that you could ride your bike or walk and didn't have to own a car. And we were looking for a place that had garden space. And probably more than anything, looking back on it, I don't know how important it was to us then, but it had to have soul. Just a box unit would not work. And this place has got soul. It's got some character, and I'd love to learn more about that. I hope to learn more about it. So, a little bit about my intentions for this place. A lot of it's still unfolding. I don't really know, but what I can say is that it's going to take a while to get there. And for right now, I'm intending to kind of keep it in the same configuration that it has been for, I guess, 30, 40 or more years, which is divided up into separate units, separate apartments. Partly because there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and that's just going to take some time to get that done. But also because I want to coalesce a group of people who are interested in living here for a period of time, for a longer period of time, and who really want to make this their home. And one of the things that I have witnessed both at the DUMA community and out when I travel about and visit other shared households is that they tend to be kind of ephemeral. It's not uncommon for people to rent a house together for a few years, and then it all kind of, people move on to different places, and all of that collective energy sort of dissipates. Or maybe the person who owns the house decides to sell it, and everyone's like really bummed because they had something really good going on. So if we want to increase density, and if we want longevity, if we want to create a better future, if we want to fulfill an obligation for the people who are coming after us, then I think it's important to think about how do we do things differently so that people can live together and gain all those benefits of living together and have it sustain itself. Have the people can stay there for years and not think like, I'm looking forward to something else, but more thinking like, why would I want anything else? And so I have a lot of thoughts about that after 30 years. And what I'm hoping to do when I coalesce a group of people is to give some presentations and workshop and to test some ideas out, some ideas that I haven't heard anyone else talk about. And I'm eager to bounce those ideas off of people and to see what their reaction is and what they learn from it and what I can learn from that. And I'm hopeful that in that conversation, in those learnings, that will help plant the seed for people to be able to thrive together in a way that some other experiments haven't been able to achieve. So that's a little bit about my vision. I'll say a few more things. One is that I'm still very committed to making living arrangements that are low impact, and I've already changed the light bulbs from incandescents to LEDs, which is a tiny step, but in time, I'm going to get this thing off of carbon fuels. It's going to be electrified. It's going to have heat pumps. Eventually, there'll be photovoltaic panels. There's going to be, thanks to Katya, there's going to be a charging station for EVs. She's the one that suggested that. And while I mentioned Katya, I want to just point out a few people who have been really helpful here and that I want to recommend. First is Katya. I've mentioned her several times. Katya and I go way back, but I turned to her as a real estate agent because her business practice is really about creating spaces like this and houses that are more ecologically oriented. And you can talk to her more about the finer details of that if you are interested in buying or selling a house. And I think she's got some business cards up here. And I also want to give a shout out to John Dumitru. Want to raise your hand? John has done a ton of work here in the last couple of weeks just to get this place ready. And he is a handy person who has been super helpful. So if you're looking for a handy person, John Dumitru. So after the commercial announcement there, I also one other thing I wanted to mention, which is not so much, certainly was not the case over on Alder Street at DUMA, but that has to do with neighborhood livability. And many of you know that there is legislation that was passed by at the state level a few years ago. I think it was House Bill 2001, which requires cities to make a plan for infill development, to plan for increased density and increased population in Eugene. And it's very, very controversial. And this neighborhood is in the crosshairs of that controversy. And one of the reasons, I put the word out to Mayor Vinnis. I don't see Mayor Vinnis here. I was hoping she might come. But one of my hopes here is to say, we can increase the number of people living together without building what I call six-pack apartments. We need to keep the big English walnut tree in the back. We need to keep the cedar tree. We need to keep open space and still have increased number of people living together. And the way to do that is to use space more efficiently. And so at DUMA, we had a house that probably had 5 or 6 people living in it and now has 9 or 10. And when I give tours of that house, I sometimes ask people a trick question. So I'm going to ask you a trick question. Remember, it's a trick question. And I ask the question, and if you know the answer to it, don't tell. The question is, what is the greenest house that you know of? Anyone want to try to answer the trick question?
The one that already exists.
That's right. The greenest house is the one that you don't have to build, right? Like at our house, we went from 6 to 9 people. We didn't expand the urban growth boundary. We didn't have more roads paved. We didn't, bring a new gas line. We just used the space more efficiently. And in a time where housing is inaffordable. The most expensive part of housing, of rooms, are bathrooms and kitchens. So if you can share bathrooms and kitchens and use those spaces like we did at DUMA for living spaces, then we can have a higher quality of life at the same cost. So I wanted, I'll take some questions in just a moment, but I first wanted to also give a shout out to some of the people who live at DUMA. We've got at least a few people here. We're all wearing little rainbow ribbons. There's Alex and Alana, and I guess the others have already, oh, and Tyrone. Thank you very much, Tyrone. I think some of the others have gone off to other things. But if you have questions about what it's like to live in community, you could talk with them. So let me see if I caught anything. The last thing I'm going to ask you to do, I know some of you are going to be like, oh, I didn't expect you to make me actually talk to other people. But I'm going to ask that you turn to someone, preferably that you don't know, and just talk about your obligation to the future. How are you going to create the world that you want the future to become? And I'm going to reconvene you in just like a minute or a couple minutes, and y'all can just shout out a couple of things that that you want to provide, and then I'll just take questions and answer, and we'll be all done, and we can enjoy more tea and hang out. So please take a moment and find someone, introduce yourself, and yes.
Can I interview you after this?
Yes. You can wrap up your conversation. I'd love to refocus. Well, my prompt was partly just to get people to talk with one another and meet new people, but I also think it's important that we vision a future that we want to see and name it and imagine how we're going to create it. So is there anyone that would like to just say a few words about what they would like to see and their obligation for the future? Andrew?
Leave the place better than you found it.
Yeah.
That's a basic obligation that we all shared, and it's a guiding light.
Yeah.
At least in my life.
Yeah. That's a good motto to live by. Anyone else? Yeah.
Obligation to utilize your skills and talents that you have.
Yeah.
Encourage others to use theirs.
Yeah, utilize your skills and talents that you have. Yeah. Thank you. Back there, Alex.
An obligation to stay open to new ideas and ways of thinking.
Obligation to new ideas and ways of thinking. John.
Be a good elder and role model.
To be a good elder and a role model.
Even if you're young.
Being a young elder and, and a role model. Absolutely. You can be young and be a role model too. Absolutely. Well, I'll take questions in just a moment. There's a couple things that I also wanted to say that I had forgotten to. And one is a little bit about the benefits of being rooted. I had no idea that I would be living in the same place 30 some odd years later. I thought I might be there for 5 years, and that when I was 24 years old was like a really long time. But looking back at that, I'll say I built a lot of social capital in this community, and that is something that's really special about Eugene. And it's, I think remembering that we have those connections and that we can draw on those connections and what's possible by having those connections. And again, I'll refer to Katya, that, like years, I haven't seen you in a couple of years, and then all of a sudden, like, it comes back around. So plant those seeds, and you don't know what's going to emerge and how it's going to grow, but they will bear fruit. And speaking of fruit, there will be fruit in this yard. There will be persimmon trees there. There will be fig trees. I don't know exactly where they're going to be, but there will be fruit. For those of you who know me, that is really appealing part of this property, that you can grow things. So, no more of me yammering, unless you all have some questions.
How many bathrooms are in the DUMA house?
Well, the DUMA house has 6 bathrooms. And for those of you who don't know the history of that house, it was built for what was the Northwest Christian College and is now Bushnell. And then it was divided up into 6 apartments. So when we bought it, we were like, wow, there's 6 bathrooms. Like, how great is that? And we've kept every one of them. So this house only has 3, and they could definitely use some work. And maybe it needed another bathroom altogether. But that is something that makes it quite a bit easier to live together. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it a big learning curve to learn how to be a successful member of a co-op that's much different from being, if you've had roommates before, you've lived in apartments with lots of people, you know how to live with people. So what's the additional thing that you have to know or learn to understand to be a co-op member?
Well, that's a good question, and that is going to be the basis of the conversations and workshops that I'm hoping to prepare this summer and fall. And so maybe you'd like to be part of that test group. I think it's quite a bit. It's not. I can't just summarize it in one sentence. So, yeah.
Do you feel like it's important? Because I know you're vegetarian in the other house. Do you feel like that's an important foundation point, or is that something that you decided as a co-op?
At that house, it's something we decided early on because at least 50% of the people who first started the community were vegetarian, and so we just sort of set that in motion. But I don't feel strongly about that here. If that's what people want to do, then that's what they'll do. But I don't want to have like a real like big footprint or thumbprint on this house in the same way I do the house that I live in. That said, I for the foreseeable future, I imagine being the owner of this house. But in the long term, I can imagine all kinds of different arrangements. I don't know exactly what it might look like. Maybe there'll be co-ownership. Maybe myself with people who live here. Maybe with land trust. There's a lot of possibilities there. So, future we'll see. Yeah.
Can you try to use some of the DUMA systems, like regular meetings and the way work chores break down, like transfer some of that here, or let the people here create their own?
Right. So, in the short term, we've got some folks living here, including Tyee and Mackenzie. You want to raise your hand? Awesome people, by the way, from families in this area. They may develop their own systems and practices. When it becomes collective, I will certainly be readily available to share sort of, best practices, if you will, what we've learned over the years at DUMA. But if something else works better for people, so shall it be. There's still plenty of room for variation or for people to learn or do things differently. Yeah.
Do you have a goal date for when this is going to be open and operating?
No, I don't. But I'm just kind of like imagining 1 to 1.5 years, something like that. It might be a transition. It might be a period of time. People's lives aren't clean and neat, and I really think all the people who will be occupying these rooms are pretty cool people, and so I don't, I'm very hesitant to ask people to leave if it's working really well. At some point in time, it probably makes sense to ultimately have a group of people all in the house, but we'll wait and see how that emerges. Yeah.
How much are the county taxes a year?
I haven't paid them yet, but I think about $3,000 or $3,500. Yeah. Part of what I'm imagining, another way of getting more people to live on this property is to use the land in the back. And there's someone who used to live at the DUMA community who is building a tiny home, and there's a nice little spot in the backyard where I'm hoping that he will live. There's probably room for a yurt to be in the backyard. So, the total population on this property might even double, by the time it's a collective of some sort. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
What's the financial structure? Is it a goal to make it affordable for low-income people, like 60% of AMI? Any such ideas?
I'm not using any particular benchmark like that, but my general attitude or approach at the DUMA community is that I want to be able to provide a higher quality living than anything else that's possible at that price. So it's this like sweet spot between making something really affordable and making something that is really a place where people can really appreciate, enjoy the aesthetics and the quality of life living there. And you can tell me whether I've struck that balance. Oh, I'm right here, Steve.
Can you give a quick rundown of the shared spaces at DUMA, or that you imagine here? I heard bathrooms, I heard kitchens,
Right.
I assume dining room, living room, shared bike parking. Is there work?
Yeah, so I don't want to talk too much about the DUMA community right now, but I'd be happy to talk with folks separately. If you're interested, there is a sign-up list on this table here where you could put your name and contact information, and I'd be happy to arrange a tour with a few people for the DUMA community, and you can take a look around there. And then these photos here also give you a sense of of our history and what it's like, and you can also talk to other people who live there now.
Wondering what might be shared space here, right?
Yeah, I heard there's a basement.
Oh, got it. I see. You mean in the near future, or in like what would be the common spaces in the future?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm imagining will probably happen is that the first floor here, this room here, will be the living room, and then there'll be a dining room that people will share. The basement is large, and it could be finished, and it could be used for all kinds of different purposes. It could be a great place for a teenager to hang out. It could be a workshop. It could be a place to play ping pong. I don't know yet. So there will be shared spaces for sure. All right. Well, thank you again so much for coming and for sharing with everyone else. And if you have any questions, let me know. I hope to keep documenting this so that we can inspire other people, whether it be in Eugene or in other places, to do something similar, because